Obrigada. Agora chamamos o professor Miguel Martinez Ramos. Antes disso, só uma coisinha. Se vocês quiserem fazer perguntas, falem, só levantar a mão para a Larissa e para a Raquel. Então, o professor Miguel Martinez é ecólogo, PhD, professor visitante da Universidade de Harvard e sabático na Universidade de Stanford e da Universidade de Berkeley, Califórnia. Professor titular do Instituto de Pesquisa de Ecossistema e Sustentabilidade da Universidade Nacional Autônoma do México e foi presidente da Associação de Biologia Tropical e Conservação, Sociedade Botânica do México e da Sociedade Ecológica Mexicana.
First of all, I want to thank all people, Deborah, Chavez, and many people from the Secretaría de Medio Ambiente de Sao Paulo that was possible to bring me here. I am very happy because I am very familiar with this country. I know this country. I have a lot of friends here. I feel like my home here. And this talk is a summary of different studies that we conducted in Mexico regarding natural regeneration and restoration uses ecological basis. And it's included studies from my lab with the different students. And I tried to summarize and provide my best effort to give indicators of these natural regeneration processes and restoration that hopefully will be useful for you. The big challenge when we use ecosystem for agriculture uses is to find those uses that enable the possibility to recover forests after they are abandoned. And this is the question when a land has been used for a long time with different agricultural activities, with different sizes and so on, what is the possibility that we have to recover forests by natural means, natural regeneration, by secondary ecological succession. And we know that as the land use increase in intensity, in area and duration, the possibility to recover forests, this is the mirror, this is the time after some activity, agricultural activity is finished, what is the possibility to recover the forest, and the intensity of different land use, agricultural land use increase, then this time become larger and larger until maybe it's not more possible because the land is degraded and there are no possibility to recover the forest by natural means. In this talk, I want to try to answer these three questions. The first one is where natural regeneration functions as a restoration tool. The second one is when natural regeneration is not possible, what activities of assisted restoration can be implemented. And the third one is how a socioeconomical criteria can be incorporated for selection native tree species for restoration. These are the three questions. The first one will be natural regeneration and agricultural land uses. We can conceive agricultural land uses as ecological disturbance regimes. In the theory of the ecology theory, we assess the impact of a natural catastrophe in terms of things like intensity, size, frequency, and so on, and that different variables constitute a disturbance regime. In this case, for agricultural land uses, we can take, for example, the duration of the land use, the extension of the field size, and the severity, which included, for example, the use of agrochemicals, the frequency of fire, the use of machinery, and also the removal of tree cover, and so on. And these three components of disturbance regimes change a lot among different agricultural land uses. For example, this is Sweden agriculture, agroforestry, or plantations, pastures, and so on. For example, the Sweden cultivation, which is done by clearing small pieces of the forest and then put corn with different other useful species, and then abandon it, and this is rotated across the space, across the forest, but it's low impact. The severity is low, the extension tends to be small, and the duration tends to be short. This is a low disturbance regime. In the other extreme, for some pasture, cattle pastures tend to be very severe because you have a cattle making disturbance across the field, and also you have fire, you have some exotic species, and so on, and then the severity is high. The extension can be, in some cases, small, but in other cases can be very large, and the duration can tend to be very long. No? In this case, pastures has a very strong disturbance regime, ecologically speaking, and Sweden cultivation is a low disturbance regime. And between these streams, there are a lot of variation. Then, when the disturbance regime increases, the site quality in terms of the environmental variables like humidity in the soil, temperature, radiation, solar radiation, and so on, decrease. This one level decrease, the site quality decrease, and that is important because most tropical plants in the forest depends on certain values of temperature, humidity, and so on, and radiation, etc. And when the disturbance is very large, the site quality become very low for most of these plants, and then they can germinate, or they can grow, or they can reproduce. And also, as disturbance regime increases, for example, the size of the field become large, and there are less and less tree cover in the field, the availability of propagules, that is the seeds on the soil, the seedlings banks, or the saplings or the sprouts decline. And then, when you have, for example, the possibility to assess what is the impact of the reduction in site quality and the reduction in propagule availability, and the field is abandoned, then the natural regression rate in terms of number of species that you have after the field is abandoned, or the biomass of that vegetation that is in process of recovering is low. Then, for example, we can expect theoretically that land uses like pastures have low natural regeneration rates of recovery because the site quality is very low and the propagule availability is low also, while land uses like Sweden cultivation, which has a very low disturbance regimes, have high rates of regeneration, recover very fast. And we are trying to test, to assess this kind of ideas using different land uses, contrasting land uses. For example, I will show you some examples here. This is the comparisons between cornfields which have low disturbance regimes versus cattle pastures that have high disturbance regimes. And the expectation is that cornfield will recover faster in terms of diversity, in terms of biomass, regarding or respect to cattle pastures. These are the results. We compare 4 pastures and 4 fields that were abandoned in the same time. And this is the stem density, the abundance of stems larger than 1 centimeter dBH in 500 square meters. And these pastures and these cornfields, you can see the huge difference in the recovery rate of the regeneration of the forest vegetation. across the first 6 years after abandonment. Also, the biomass indicated by basal area has increased rapidly in the cornfields, abandoned cornfields, respect to the pastures. Pastures doesn't have, in these terms, much value in terms of, for example, the gain in carbon storage or sequestration, respect to what's happening in the abandoned cornfields. In terms of maximum size of the trees, you see in cornfields is rapidly increasing, but the pastures is almost less than half of the size. Finally, the density of species or species richness increased rapidly in the cornfields, and the pastures is become very low. Then the land use that you have in a particular site influence very much what is the expectancy to have in the forest recovery properties. And also the effects is important in terms of composition. Cornfields, for example, have species that are typical of the rainforest, where in the place where we work. For example, Trichospermum is a typical pioneer species, Ochroma or Heliocarpus or Piper is a typical species in the rainforest. But in the pasture, you have, for example, Bisonima crassifolia or Curatella or Pismia, which are more related with savannoid vegetation, more dry vegetation. Then these pastures tend to change the composition and the structure of the covering forest. And that is because the disturbance regimes imposed by different land use impact the structure and composition of regeneration forest. Also, you can see that in the cornfields, few species dominates over the first 6 years of succession. This is for species. In pastures, you have more species included, but of a small size. Okay. In order to provide a general index to assess the disturbance regimes, Isela Cermeño did her PhD thesis constructing this ecological disturbance index that is based on information provided by landowners and farmers. She went to the Marqués de Comillas region in southeastern Mexico, and was interviewing like 60 different farmers, asking for information about these properties in terms of how large is the field area in terms of hectares, what is the duration that they has been using each field in terms of years, and the severity was assessed by asking the frequency of fire, agrochemicals, machinery, cattle load, tree cover in the field. Okay, with these three components, she did this index that include sub-indices that are scaled in terms of the maximum value observed across the different fields in terms of size, in terms of duration, and in terms of severity. We also assess another kind of indices, but this one was the best, and the index vary between 0 and 3. There is a paper already published that describes the details of this index. Then Isela described the different disturbance regimes across different land uses in the landscapes in this area of Marqués de Comillas. And for example, pasture resulted with the larger sizes, in average 15 hectares in extension, and other agricultural uses has much smaller. The duration was more or less the same across the different land uses, but the severity component with the fire use, chemical use, machinery use, or cattle pasture, the number of cattle in the field, and the cover of trees in the fields was very different across the different land uses. And as a result of these differences, the ecological disturbance index changed importantly among the different land uses. For example, cattle patches was with the higher ecological disturbance, and the coffee plantations was the smaller disturbance. Then the next step was to assess whether this index predict the capacity of recovery of the forest in terms of diversity or in terms of other variables. Then you can see here, when she selected 9 different fields with different land uses, and for each land use was obtained the disturbance index, and as the disturbance index increases, the plant density declines very sharply. The species density also declines very sharply, and this is the number of species, and this is the diversity index in terms of Shannon, also declined very sharply. Okay. Then with a simple index for this area and probably for other areas, you can assess the impact of the agricultural land uses on the capacity of the forest to recover. Okay? Okay. And it's interesting because the land use, agricultural land use classified by types, for example, for pastures and cornfields, is not enough, because the same land use can differ very strongly in terms of the disturbance that they produce. In this example, you can see 3 different uses for pasture uses for cattle that produce milk, only milk, that produce meat, and that produce meat and milk, double purposes. Then in an experiment using this disturbance index, the meat cattle produced for the cattle used for producing meat had the lower disturbance index, and the cattle used to produce meat and milk has a higher disturbance index, and thus that producing milk has an intermediate value. And when these different patches were enclosed to enable the recovery of the forest, you see that the patches used to produce meat increased very rapidly in terms of number of stems, also in terms of number of species, and the other ones maintain very low recovery rates. And that patches were in the same landscape, having the same sources of seeds to recover for regeneration. And also you can scale this index that was designed to assess the disturbance regime in a given field to the landscape. If you know the proportional area covered by different land uses, you can construct this ecological disturbance index weighted by the mean proportion covered for each land uses in the landscape. This is one landscape, there's another landscape, on landscape. And by multiplying the ecological index of each land use type by the proportion that is covered in the landscape, you have this weighted mean of the ecological disturbance index. Then we do an assessment if this index works at the landscape level by selecting different landscape units that have different proportions of old growth forests remaining in the landscape. For example, here you have a landscape where only 7% of the old growth forest remains, and most of the area is covered by pastures, while you have another landscape that have a mixture of the different land uses, and this is the control where you have only old growth forests, totally covered by old growth forests. Then when the ecological disturbance is weighted by the proportions of land uses increases, the number of species in the secondary forests with a similar age in all these different landscapes decline very dramatically. And also the basal area or the biomass of the forest, the secondary forest, decline with increases of the disturbance regime. Then also this index can be scaled to the landscape to find which of these different landscapes can provide better levels of biodiversity or better levels of biomass that implies different things for ecosystem services. Okay, I will pass to the second point, is if regeneration not possible, what can you do? One thing that is possible to do simply is removing grasses. By removing grasses, for example, we find that bacillarea increase very importantly respect to the pasture that maintain grasses. Removing grasses enable the recovery of the forest. But this effect is only possible when you are close to the seed sources. The distance to nearest old-growth forests is less than 500 meters. It's possible to have better regeneration when you exclude or you remove grasses respect when the grasses are present. If the distance is very far, the effect is no more evident because no seeds become established or arrive to these areas. Another possibility is to protect the seeds from predators because seed predation in the fields are very high. As you see in this study conducted by Alejandra Corso, most this black section correspond to seeds removed in only 64 days after putting the seeds in the field. And there are different species, and in only 64 days, more than 90% of the seeds are removed by animals. And if you exclude the seeds from the animal attack, you can have a very important proportion of seeds germinating, both in the secondary forest and also in the primary forest. But this is very important in terms of the secondary forest. You can put the seeds and protect the seeds, and then you increase the probability to emerge, to have seedlings. This is for the case of secondary or pioneer species. This is the case for primary or mature species. It's also very important to protect the seeds if you are planning to put seeds for restoration. And in pastures also, the predation rates are very high. This is for the different two primary species. In only 64 days, most of the seeds was removed by ants, by mice. But if you use this kind of protection, you can have a proportion of the seeds emerged producing seedlings. Otherwise, you will lose all the seeds. And also, you can use seedlings to assist regeneration. In this study, we are using different pioneer species or light demanding species that were introduced to pastures in two treatments. One is with the grasses, and another treatment was removing the grasses. Okay, and Cedrela odorata was a very important. This is a relative performance index that is obtained by multiplying growth rates and survival rates. Cedrela odorata is a very good species growing very well in the presence of grasses. But, for example, Trema Trichocerum mexicanum is a very good species growing in absence of grasses. Okay? But that depends in the date you plant the seedlings. If you plant the seedlings in the rainy season, Cedrela odorata is very important with the presence of grasses, and Trichospermum in the absence of grasses. But if you plant the seedlings in the dry season, other species like Sonalum will become very important also for the establishment of that species. Then the idea is that you can start to restore pastures by selecting species with different attributes that can deal with the rain or with the drought, and also with the coping with the grasses or no. And the last thing is how we can incorporate socioeconomic criteria in the development of some indices for selecting native species for restoration. Okay. And in this study, Paula Meli produced a selection, an index to select species with socioecological criteria. She included 5 different criterion. One is the natural dominance of the species, that species in the agroforest. This is how much of the total biomass is represented by that species. The second one is the abundance of juvenile trees in secondary forests. If that species has, for example, a population structure with high amounts of juveniles, that indicates that that species can regenerate well in secondary forests. The third one is the habitat breadth. These species may grow in different soils, and different topographies, and different geomorphological units, and that implies that have the capacity to deal with different environmental settings. The fourth one is the value, social value. This is the people wants to have species for some uses, for example, for firewood, for food, for many other things, for construction. And it's important to select species that are providing some goods for the people. And the last one is the technical constraints, which implies how easy it is to get seeds, how easy it is to develop the ceilings in the greenhouses, and so on, and how easy it is to transport them, the ceilings, to the field, and the possibility to establish in the abandoned field. And this is a list of species ranked by this index, the selection index. The Allen guyanense in our area is a very important species for restoration, while Castilla Lestica is a relative not recommended for restoration according with this index. And this study is already published in Applied Vegetation Science, where you can find the details about the index. The other index is trying to incorporate the economical cost related to the production of the seedlings and the activities you need to do while protecting the seedlings once you introduce or planting the seedlings in the field. This index is the include this IRA, which is the integral response index based on the survival rate and growth rate of the transplanted seedlings in the field, with protection. When, for example, you can put some barriers in order to avoid predation by herbivores or other animals. Also, you can make some modification in the environment to improve the growth and survival of the seedling. And without protection, just planting the seedling. And also it incorporates the propagation and transportation costs per plant for the seedlings. And finally, this is the CC, is a transplanting cost. This is a mistake here. This CC, transplanting cost of seedling with and without protection. Then you have, for example, here is the protection cost. The protection cost can be very high in some circumstances, and then this ratio becomes lower than 1. And when the survival rate and growth rate of the seedlings with protection and without protection are similar, then this index is equal to 1 or less than 1, okay? Because this component tend to be lower than 1. And this, if this ratio is equal to 1, then this index is below 1. And then in that case, that species is very good for uses for restoration. And we assess the usefulness of this index in this system. In marqué de comillas, we have a lot of problems with Pteridium naquilinum, bracken fern, because in pastures that have been used for a long time, these species become established and start to form thick carpets. In some cases, extending several hectares, covering several hectares. Irene Suazo did his PhD thesis in that system and find that when there are different land use change histories, since the forest is cut and then establish crops, or the forest is cut and then establish crops and then abandon it for fallow periods, and then you put crops again. Another history is the forest, crop, fallow period, and then pastures, and so on. We have 5 different line history routes or pathways. And the pathway that produce the invasion of the pteridium is the number 5, when you have pastures. You see the number 5 here, pass to forests, crops, and fallow period, and then pastures. And the pteridium or bracken invasion is produced when you have this trajectory in soils and poor soils, in acidic soils. And then you have this this kind of problem in the field. Okay, now the Lilibet conducted another experiment by removing the bracken fern and planting species with different attributes, and we assess how much the different species perform with and without the fern. And using the index, we find that most of the species, well, after 1 year, more or less, were growing very well, survive very well, and also they grow well. But by using the different costs for producing the seeds, the seedlings, excuse me, and to transport the seedlings and to protect the seedlings from the different environment with and without bracken fern, this species that has less than 1 value, Tabebuia guayacán or Chroma pyranea, especially Cohoba arborea, are could be important for using restoration in the restoration process of these bracken fern areas. While species like, for example, Cecropia or Brosimum are not recommendable because they suffer high mortality or lower growth, and also they have a high cost for producing the seedlings in the greenhouse or for transplantation. Then this simple index can be used to identify those species that are very low for production in terms of economy, but also that behave very well in the field. Okay, then at least we have starting to provide indicators or indices that can be used to assess which agricultural land uses can be friendly with the recovery of secondary forests or ranging forests at the field level and the landscape level. And also we are providing indexes, very simple indexes, to identify those species that can be useful for restoration in a given disturbance condition. And finally, I want to say that this kind of restoration problems is a socio-ecological problem, where you have to consider that the effects of socio factors or drivers can emerge from global scales, like, for example, some international politics, like what describing Ceferino in the morning, but also can be related to local decisions of the people related, for example, for their institutions or for their knowledge or for their perception, attitudes, and so on. There are different levels affecting the decision that people do in a local scale. And at the same time, you have these ecological drivers or factors that affects what is happening at a local level. Climate change, for example, is very important at a global scale. But what happens in terms of the genetics of the seedlings you are using, or the ecological microhabitats that are present in the site you are restoring, and so on, are important. Then there is different scales, phenomena affecting the local situation, and if you do some local activity here and it's integrated in the landscape and the region and the global, will be important for the different success of the restoration programs. And I think that restoration is a socio-ecological problem, and we need to link the social component and the ecological component in order to have successful histories about this topic. Thank you very much.
Bom, se vocês quiserem fazer perguntas, passem para as meninas que estão circulando, por favor. Então, passamos a palavra agora para o professor Ahmed Khan, cuja apresentação será sobre o programa de restauração na África do Sul. Ele tem pós-graduação em Ciências Ambientais, é diretor de suporte operacional e planejamento de programas de gestão de recursos naturais do Departamento de Assuntos Ambientais da África do Sul. Ele atua na gestão, planejamento, pesquisa, gestão de informação e treinamento e desenvolvimento para a carteira de programas da gestão de recursos naturais.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Who wants to stand and just stretch their legs a bit? Are you feeling a bit tired now after more than 2 hours of talking? You're welcome to. I don't mind. I wish to thank the Secretariat for the honor of presenting to our BRICS partner. And I hope, well, so far it's been very stimulating, and you've made me feel very welcome. My theme will be somewhat, maybe, I won't say less scientific, but a lot more about the institutional processes and experiences we've had in South Africa with large-scale restoration programs. So that's going to be an idea about what's the history that informed it, why did we do it the way we did it, and what are some of the current challenges that perhaps might be of interest to Brazil as well, which I see as being at a stage now where you're also contemplating similar type of processes, but perhaps we can learn more from you even. I also have to say, I'm going to talk about killing trees. So those of you that's squeamish, maybe you should close your ears. They are invasive, of course, in South Africa, pine trees, although they might be a very valuable sort of economic species here in Brazil. In South Africa, they do pose a significant threat to water resources. So when did it start and why? Back in 1995, let me learn to control this. We had to look at some of the key country challenges that we were facing. So we are a significantly dry country with huge water resource management challenges, and at the same time, a huge unemployment problem as well. If you know our history, you'll understand what led to, I think, some of those, factors that we have to deal with as a country. So 1994, since democracy, was a nice time to start thinking about things in a fresh way. I'm not suggesting that you need to change regimes to start restoration programs. I'm just saying good political leadership with vision is sometimes a good precondition for starting something that people might say, this is quite far-reaching in what it is you want to achieve. So we pulled together a lot of researchers and scientists that had, since the early 1930s, built up long-term catchment experiments on water use by invasive woody plants, for example, your eucalyptus and pines, in a lot of our watershed areas. And that's sort of a simple graphic presentation of what that data essentially meant. And this we took to the politicians at the time, the Department of Water Affairs in South Africa, and we said, if we don't manage the problem now, in 20 years' time, you're going to have a much worse problem in terms of water supply and perhaps also water quality issues. So let's catch the problem early before it becomes a problem later on. Some people say we went to extremes because we actually slowed down the need for building additional infrastructure, and maybe that's the problem we're sitting with today. But again, I think if you look at some of the economic models that we've used to justify that investment, it was telling us that with very little additional cost for generating water, you can have, essentially, if we don't clear now, with the spread of invasives, that cost would just kind of escalate over time. And so it's best to do your activities and restoration initiatives early before it becomes quite a huge, I think, drain on the economy in years to come. So that was just a measure we used to explain to the water engineers as well, because there was a certain sort of mindset in the Department of Water Affairs that said, if you have a water supply problem, let's build more dams. What does it cost to produce 1 kiloliter of water? So we had to use a measure to convince them, you can use just a little bit, 6% per kiloliter to generate water to do restoration by removing invasives. And so that's something I think that the minister at that time sort of believed in. This is just an illustration of our census data in South Africa. So an indication of the level of poor households that we have across the country. It gives you an indication at the catchment level, what is the situation we're dealing with. So essentially, poverty is a huge problem in South Africa, and that was a nice selling point as well. We could take to the politicians and say, let's marry this restoration objective with job creation. So these were our political champions. I don't think I need to mention the gentleman on the left. And that's our Minister of Water Affairs at that stage, the late Minister Kader Asmal. So it took, I think, visionary leaders at that stage to say, you know what, I'm going to take a risk, but I can potentially see some huge benefits in the long run that also deals with my sort of challenges. But we also need, I think, visionary leaders. So this is our program leader that had to sell it to the minister. Maybe I should keep this thing away from me. And you get your leaders, but then you also get the foot soldiers. And the passionate and committed people that initially started off those implementation initiatives were the ones that actually started saying, we can make this work. It's something that's actually successful. Now, if you look at outputs, this is what we've been able to achieve since 1995. 10 billion rand, I think in Brazilian reals, that's probably 2.5 billion, if I'm right. Yeah. 3 million hectares of land, where we've done some initial treatment. The first time we sort of cleared invasives out of that area. And then 10 million hectares where we had to go and do follow-up. Because it's not a once-off initiative. You have to go back and maintain the area. A lot of people were saying, you started off so quickly, you didn't actually know what you were doing. Are you strategically achieving the objectives that you set aside? So, you know, some people were saying, what's your plan B? Well, some people said, where's your plan A? But I think what was exciting about that was we could learn as we were going along. We didn't have to wait for saying, let's get the Rolls-Royce model for implementing this. Let's use a Mini or a Volkswagen to say, let's get started. But I think what we didn't have is also the benefit, maybe don't focus on the slide, the benefit of having long-term monitoring that also was telling us you actually are doing the right things. And I think that's maybe an advice we can give to Brazil. If you can build good long-term monitoring experiments that can show the outcomes and the impacts, that's going to make your case so much easier. So this is the programs currently in the stable of Department of Environmental Affairs. I'm part of the Natural Resource Management Programs, and it deals with invasives, wetlands, ecosystems, essentially where you have soil erosion problems in certain catchments. Working for forests, where we look at maybe stimulating indigenous forest recovery, and also for silvicultural purposes, maintaining abandoned community forests that has commercial value still, but is not economically viable. And then working on fire, and of course also how do you potentially use the biomass from your interventions to generate secondary benefits. Sorry, on the other side is just another sister suite of programs that's also falling under the Department of Environmental Affairs. So they're also looking more at sort of urban greening and infrastructure development from an environmental perspective. I think what's important for us is to understand why are we doing this? If you do this restoration management intervention, what are you actually able to measure as an ecosystem service that's going to benefit from that work? And I think this is an important monitoring and evaluation process you have to put in place that identifies what's the overall impact you want to achieve in the long run, whether it be dealing with exposure to natural disasters, food security, health, improved fisheries, sort of the key important, I think, country-level impacts you want to make. And then what are the outcomes you need to achieve? To get there? What is it that we can measure that tell us we're on our way to achieving that impact? And then ultimately, I think, related back to what is the land management intervention you need to focus on? So as I was saying, we're dealing with invasives, rehabilitating wetlands. That's an important water quality management kind of focus as well in South Africa, as well as utilizing fire as an ecological tool to stimulate sort of ecosystem functioning. So that's an important sort of nexus of activities: water, land, fire. I mean, what more do you need? Isn't that a name of a band? Earth, Wind, and Fire. But I think at the same time, if we want to do it in a way that actually is a meaningful employer in the long run, we have to understand the context of what is the employment sector that you want to influence. And ultimately, I think any country would like to get to a stage that is good for growth and good for jobs. I think I have to confess, we're still stuck here with public employment programs where you employ masses of people, but it's not great for the growth of the economy. So I think when we talk about long-term restoration kind of interventions, you need to start identifying how do you shift from that, how do you shift from that kind of quadrant to your labor-intensive, mid-processing, but from a green economy type of perspective. And I think that's the shift in South Africa, where we're starting to talk more of ecological infrastructure as an input to the economy, and how then do we kind of conserve that. But we have limited resources. I think we were very good at initially proving to government we can create jobs, but there's a finite sort of bag of money from the taxpayer that's going to say, we'll fund you. And we've had to then develop a mechanism where we start prioritizing. How is it that you're going to justify investing in one catchment over another? So this is a very high-level scale, national scale sort of criteria that we use to decide on where we invest some of our restoration resources. So you'll see it covers a wide range of spatial criteria that deals with the poverty criteria that I spoke about, dependence on ecosystems, the communities living there. How important is it to have that ecosystem function the way it does? And what's the services they derive from that ecosystem? Whether it be water, food, fiber. So at a very basic level, you should be able to say, by investing here, we can directly sort of monitor that that community is going to benefit from that investment. So this is just, I don't expect you to really engage in this. I'll leave you with a website address at the end where you can really unpack and criticize, I think, some of the assumptions we've had to make in using some of these criteria. Because the reality is, in certain locations in the country, you're going to have to weight certain criteria differently depending on what the objective is you want to achieve. And of course, we have to look at what's the ecosystem service that's going to benefit from our investment. So that's at a high level scale nationally that we decide where does the money need to go at the catchment or watershed level, I suppose you would call it in Brazil. But then you also get to the reality on the ground where you can come from the top and you can say this is what we want to do, but the reality is very different in terms of the livelihood perspective that the community comes from. So how important is it actually for them to restore? Maybe they have much more pressing concerns than seeing the catchment operate in a way that it should. So we've had to kind of think about how do we implement in a much more logical, bottom-up way as well to ensure that our intervention is actually owned by the community and they can see the benefit that emanate from doing the investment. So you would start with what's the livelihood assets that's going to benefit from our interventions, and then I think go through the process of, I think, engaging the community and unpacking that intervention and making sure they understand the value and what is the ownership that they need to take of it, because they are the key agents actually in the intervention. Sorry, I'm trying to talk too fast because I think I'm running out of time. Is the time still fine? But life is not so simple. This is an example of one catchment in South Africa, in KwaZulu-Natal, the Umgeni catchment. And these are the current stakeholders that's doing restoration work in one catchment. So it just shows you the different linkages and coordination kind of processes you need to go through if you want to say, are we spending meaningfully and strategically in the way we want to do restoration? So it's not an easy job. Let me just, I think, tell you that. And if you have an institutional arrangement that can unlock some of these fuzzy lines, it'll help you in the long run. I think 80% of my time is spent in convincing some of these partners, let's work together. But then it's also about how do we align our institution as Department of Environmental Affairs and the local community to ensure that coordination between private sector as well. I think what we want to do is start unlocking private sector resources to make up the shortfall in current resources we have to kind of invest enough to do what the restoration demands. At the moment, we're doing the basic minimum. I think they estimated that we have to increase our budget 6-fold to get to a level where actually we can show we're making a difference. So unlocking the private sector in that is, I think, crucial. Sorry, I'm not looking at this side of the room, so focusing here. But then I think we also have to understand what are some of the employment models, because if employment is the mechanism through which you want to do this restoration, what are some of the different mechanisms you can use that's flexible enough to cater for the local situation? So ultimately, we started with, in the beginning, direct employment of communities. So they would come to work, and every day they pitch up to do some level of restoration, they would get a wage. We then, since then, moved into community enterprises that can actually bid for longer-term clearing or restoration contracts. But now we're also realizing you need to, I think, tie down those communities for much longer periods. So we're able to sign 3-year agreements with what we call land user incentives, where we are able to say, now we can commit you to doing this restoration for a much longer time frame, and you don't need to struggle with juggling livelihoods in doing this work. It's actually a full-time job for 3 years at least. 3 years because that's our funding cycle in the public sector. You get given 3-year budgets, so hopefully we can increase that as well in years to come. So we're paying wages essentially to do these interventions through time-bound projects and to enable us, I think, to restore productive landscapes. But there's so many different tweaks to the approaches that we've had to adopt in doing this restoration. So in the Eastern Cape, for example, there was a land user incentive that came to us and said, why don't we look at eco-ranges as a kind of mechanism to employ people to do more than just sort of a single restoration intervention, and using the existing sort of cultural and traditional systems of managing that areas. So these are, I think, are only a horseback team of restorers in South Africa. I think most of us like to visit that site because you get a free horse ride. But it also begins to kind of do more than just one particular restoration intervention. So you can see they are able to do a wide range of different things, but also tying in with the local livelihood. So here, cattle grazing and cattle farming is an important economic driver. So make that part of their activity. They can still farm with cattle, but doing it in an environmentally sensitive way. And now we're looking at how can we market that, because the cattle that you generate in a catchment that's wisely managed can earn a bit more money on the market. So that's a kind of almost like a FSC type certification that we can do with the meat in that area. And I think these are just pictures of some of those examples. You can see what the landscape kind of has to deal with. This erosion primarily due to overgrazing. And these are some of the ecosystem interventions that the community has been able to put in place. Then again, 80% of South Africa is in private ownership, but there's a significant proportion of the remaining 20 that's owned by tribal authorities. And there one has to do a different type of engagement to understand how is it that they can also support restoration. Because traditionally they were sort of ignored in terms of their land rights, and everybody forgot about them. So we've been fortunate to be approached by a tribal authority and said, we have a long-term vision of making our area as economically viable as possible, but in an environmentally sustainable way. Can you help us to actually build on restoration initiatives in our tribal area as well? And this is a very good example where the community themselves came to us instead of the other way around, so they could identify what is it they want from us and the ownership they need to take of it to get the kind of natural resource management and restoration to work for them. So there's a lot of agricultural sort of activities they are engaged in, but they also appreciate that by doing restoration, those industries that they have in mind will be sort of guaranteed for years to come. This is an interesting, another initiative. I think South Africa just sometimes, we think up new ideas as if it's a hobby. But this has been proposed by a group called Wildlands that started saying, paying somebody is not always a good thing in certain localities. You can't always get employment out of it. So why don't we, where we have to do restoration by replanting with indigenous or native species, why don't we get the communities to grow the species themselves? So they get given the seeds, they grow it at home, and they come and barter when it is sort of a seedling back to the project, and then they can barter with things that they actually need, whether it be food, clothes, education. And it's an interesting new kind of mechanism of saying this might be a much more sustainable vehicle in certain rural locations where they begin to associate this greenpreneurship with very real kind of benefits. And I think this is something you have to look out for, because there's going to be significant benefits where we have to pay very little to actually get a lot out of the community. But we also have to make economic arguments for saying, why is restoration important? So this is a catchment in the Eastern Cape called the Ntabalanga Dam catchment. They're planning to build a dam there, costing us 16 billion rand. But we've shown that because of the condition of the catchment upstream of the dam, it's going to cost them basically 25 billion rand over 100 years to constantly dredge that dam from the sedimentation that ends up in it. So by spending a fraction on restoration, you can actually start saying, you know what, if you don't do it, it makes no economic sense. And that's been able to convince the decision makers that's building the dam. Part of building a dam is actually to plan also for restoration upstream of that catchment. So that's a powerful tool, I think, to convince decision makers as well. Again, I said we kill invasives, but we're also happy about invasives because it's a gift that keeps on giving. we've been able to think beyond just leaving the biomass in the field that we've cut down. How do we actually generate some potential offsets from that biomass in field that can sustain public investment in, for example, furniture? School desks is a exciting opportunity that's emerged from that. We buy most of our school desks from China, so we've been able to not necessarily kill the Chinese market, but we've saved money for government in saying you don't need to go that way. We actually have some in-house resources with very little input. We can actually make school desks out of this wood. So as you can see, we've put 500,000 learners behind the school desk in 1 year. If that's not a good indicator, I don't know what is. Yeah. But now we're starting to also look at, you can make school desks, why not houses? Similar concept, and there's a huge backlog of housing in South Africa, especially low-income housing. And the approach that the government has adopted is not very sustainable. So we've gone to them and said, at half the cost of what it costs you now to put up a low-income house, we can use the wood fiber waste from some of our eco-furniture factories to actually come up with a wood cement composite that's also fire retardant, and start looking at different concepts in low-income housing. And I think for us that's a game changer, because this alone can offset at least 40% of our restoration costs if it takes off from a Department of Human Settlements perspective. This is just the initial model that we've come up with. When you come to Cape Town, I'll gladly take you to come see what it looks like. But essentially, it starts off with a shell, a shack, I suppose that's what you would call it, and you can, over time, essentially do a double-story dwelling. It's still a lot better than the low-income housing that we currently are paying for at probably double this cost, and at the same time, we're doing it through a restoration intervention. So who said construction and restoration can't go together? But then again, there's so many other potential benefits of utilizing. Oh, I still have 15 minutes. Okay, so now I can slow down. How do we also use waste to biochar? Wood wool blankets. Again, this is an important restoration material. So in essence, you can use biomass that you've cleared to support you with developing restoration material, with stabilizing banks of rivers, and essentially being able to, I think, do a lot more with very little. This is why I say invasives is the gift that keeps on giving. And I'm sure there's even more opportunities. But I suppose the point I want to make to you is you must dream big. There might be small steps you have to take in between, but sometimes some of the sort of indirect benefits won't be clear to you in the beginning, but it'll reveal itself over time. Now again, with climate change is another opportunity that we've had to dial into and say, by doing restoration of landscapes, it's one of the most significant and powerful vehicles where you can start looking at a sort of mitigating against climate change in South Africa and adapting your landscape to withstand any climate change effects. So this is a project in the Eastern Cape where we've basically restored a lot of the native biomass in that particular catchment. It's the thicket biome, and it's what they call locally spekboom species that we've planted there. That's an excellent carbon sequestration species. So in essence, we've been able to improve the ability of that area to sort of store carbon almost double. And it's not important for us from a carbon trading perspective, more as a commitment from a South African perspective to the international targets of saying, this is actually what we are doing to offset, I think, carbon. Again, this is just an assessment of what potentially is possible in each of the different biomes in South Africa, well, in certain parts of the country, and the activity one can engage with to do that. But clearly, your subtropical and grassland restoration initiatives have significant opportunities in, I think, offsetting carbon. And that's where perhaps we need to prioritize some of our restoration interventions. But you also shouldn't forget about the skills development. I think I've spoken about the challenges we faced with underemployment and poor skills in our economy. That's actually a big factor we have to deal with. So if you're going to use employment as a model to do sort of large-scale restoration, focus on the skills that you actually need to develop and putting in a long-term skills development program that actually you can sustain. So how do you move from an unskilled, unemployed, uneducated sometimes sort of work seeker to somebody that can compete in a formal natural resource or restoration market? And how can you sustain that learning over a long time? It's almost like a university of life. And I think you have to be able to put funds against that kind of capacity development. It's not going to happen on its own. And we've had to think long and hard about how do we graduate people from that level right down to that level. We're probably still there at the moment, but we're wanting to sustain this much more in the long run. And this is where the socio-ecological stuff also comes in, I think, that Miguel spoke about. That actually people are at the center of being able to drive this restoration initiative, if I understood you correctly. Okay. Some lessons learned. I'm winding up now, so that's fine. People mobilize around success. I think in the beginning, if we started and we failed, everybody would have just said, that was a nice exercise, but bye-bye, you know? So we've been able to, in a very short space of time, say, these are what we've been able to gain. But at the same time, you must be willing to make mistakes. It happens. Learn from it. Don't let it stop you from trying it in the first place. Also, build the systems around people and capacity and invest in maintaining this capacity. I think we've been victims of our own success in that we've allowed people to come, enter, and leave willy-nilly without being able to sustain them in a kind of a career-type intervention. And that's primarily because it was a public works, stopgap employment type of intervention. And what we're saying is, actually, we can develop a career out of doing restoration if we develop the skills program that goes along with that. Be flexible. I think we're not alone when it comes to bureaucracy and being overloaded with workloads, that you have to be able to have a system that's flexible enough to say, how do we marry the implementation ideals with also some of the financial auditing kind of responsibilities? Unfortunately, in South Africa, it's the financial auditors at the moment that determine how you shape your implementation programs, and I don't think that's sustainable. But the point is, there's significant workloads. You might as well just prepare yourself for it and make sure you actually enjoy the ride, perhaps, although I don't know what's enjoyable about that ride. Legislative and regulatory tools. I know currently you're at the sort of starting process of formalizing a lot of your regulatory environments. And I think that's also been quite important for us. And that's a bit what we feel like now at the moment, because that legislative kind of rules and regulations also come with responsibility. And if you don't get your systems in place to actually manage the legislation and enforce it, actually you're also setting yourself up to fail. So I think just keep that in mind. Luckily, we have these invasive species regulations now that we can go to a landowner and say, you're not willing to kind of participate in this restoration initiative, but legislatively, you're meant to control those invasive species. So either we use the carrot or the stick. It's your choice. And sometimes you must use the stick, I think. And make sure you have the knowledge back up for the way you value, excuse me, and restore natural infrastructure and ecosystem services. So I'm afraid you can't see that so clearly, but clearly what we try to kind of demonstrate over time is there's definitely scientific evidence and research that we funded that backs up the effects that we're wanting to manage. Thank you so much. Do I have time to drink, or is my time up? Would you mind if I take a sip? Thank you. So I think the scientific backup and knowledge base is so important to ensure you can sustain and keep on convincing the decision makers we're right in doing this. And I think there's a partnership that you cannot get away from. And I think, Rafael, even here in Brazil, it sounds like you have some very good engagements with your academia and scientific community to make things work. Obrigado, boa sorte. I can't pronounce that, but I think what I want to tell you is thank you, and you must enjoy enjoy the challenge, I think, that lies ahead of you. Am I right? It does mean good luck and enjoy. Am I right? So there's our website if you're interested in some of the detail that I spoke about. But I thank you very much. Obrigado.
Peço aos palestrantes que componham a mesa para o debate, eu vou chamar também o professor Klaas Bengtsson para mediar a mesa. O professor Klaas é mestre em silvicultura, diretor da SSC Florestal e membro do Conselho de Administração SSC Américas, do Chile. Fundador da Eco Innovation Foundation, trabalha com o desenvolvimento de novas oportunidades de negócio para os agricultores florestais de pequena escala, pequenos agricultores. Podem compor a mesa.
I guess you have some more questions, maybe? More one. Only that one. Okay, fine. Excellent. Oh, yes. Yes, I will start with a small introduction, so you can... First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and all the speakers here. We are very proud to be invited to you. We know that Brazil is one of the absolutely leading countries in the world in taking care in forests and looking at different challenges in the forest sector. And also, thank you very much for still being here. I mean, 4 hours, no coffee break, no... If you want to jump a little bit like this, feel free. So, during this few days I have been in Brazil. I've been a lot in Latin America, especially in Chile, in El Salvador, some other countries, Peru, Ecuador, but very little, only once before in Brazil. But one thing I really noticed very early, and I put it on picture here, is that we maybe misunderstand each other when we talk about forest management and foresters and forest restoration and reforestation. But if we can agree on this one, forest management, the beautiful art of taking care of the forest resources, it's not any specific kind of forest management. It doesn't mean plantation of eucalyptus. It doesn't mean monoculture, and it doesn't mean restoration of native forests. It can be different things in different situations. But for me, it's like an art. And there is good art, beautiful paintings, and there is also sometimes bad art. You don't like it, you don't feel that it's a masterpiece at all. And it's the same with forest management. We lose the
sound.
Sorry? Okay, okay, I will. Forest management for me is really something that is very open-minded for different alternatives, as long as we reach objectives. And the objectives is definitely not always to get a lot of wood out of the forest. It's to get a lot of different values for the society and for everybody that lives in and around the forests, including, of course, all the flora and fauna and, of course, the people. So I want to point out, because sometimes when we talk about, for example, reforestation, to me, as coming from Sweden, we talk about getting what we think is the natural forest, or most of the natural forest or native forests. We don't use very much of exotics in Sweden, basically nothing. So for me, it's automatically, and Torsten told me, he didn't even think about telling you that it was a restoration of the natives with the native species. So maybe you thought that reforestation was about monoculture or plantation. So it's very easy to misunderstand each other. And I want all of us together to take back the word, take back forest management as something that doesn't mean any specific thing, something that can be good and bad, and we can discuss what is good and bad. Take back the word for reforestation. It's really about reforestation, and that can mean different things, of course, but put the objectives and work for those to reach those objectives. I think this is a kind of key aspect of being successful. I'm still waiting for some pictures.
Too much resolution. Higher resolution picture.
We were close. And when taking back this word to what I think is a little bit more correct using it, I think we take back also forestry and also maybe the foresters that are involved. They doesn't necessarily be people that work with industrial forests only for wood. They can achieve many, many different objectives. And depending on the objectives that they have, and that is set by the people living in the forest around, and by the society, and also by the international society. And I think this has been already said during this morning, but we have really, really big challenges. And when you have a big challenge, you have to be brave. You have to take action. And I think that was also Ahmed here, talking about taking a little bit of risk, but see that things happen. And when you have big challenges, you need large scale. You cannot solve big problems with small solutions. So we're talking about large scale restoration today, this morning, and that is very important to remember. We need to find the way to get it into large scale, and not think that we could wait like 100 years and do small steps. Doesn't mean that we should be stupid. We should listen to the researchers. We should be very careful in what we do, but we must think about how this can be scalable, what we are doing. And to be scalable, I think all these issues need to be included in our thinking. Okay. I think we almost touched this picture. I didn't know your pictures before the presentation. But we have big challenges. We have things that we really need to solve. Water, biodiversity, climate, people are poor in some areas, but we have huge resources to deal with it. But these resources are like half sleeping, and we need to make these resources active. And I think that's a great thing coming here to Sao Paulo, where you really have started this work. And to me, it seems like the word and the state of Sao Paulo is a little bit the same. You have the same challenges and the same kind of opportunities, because these large-scale opportunities, where there is maybe 2 billion hectares available for landscape restoration around the world, actually you also in your state, despite the fact that there are living like 40 million people or something in a relatively small area, you at the same time actually have quite a lot of areas that can be restored and have forests in the future, and valuable forests. And the key players in this team that maybe sometimes are not in the team, but I've talked to these people. All these pictures are my own pictures, and I visit these people, I talk to them, and this is smallholders from different parts of the world, because I've not been to smallholders in Brazil. There are no photos from Brazil, unfortunately. But there is like a very strong feeling that these people want to act. They want to be a part of this development. They want to go out, work. They want to invest time, if they have very often money. Even if they're small scale, they have some few dollars to invest, but they can do it in a business that they believe is giving them something back. So, in the world, I think close to forests and under relatively poor condition, and sometimes very poor condition, there lives about 1.4 million people. And that is an enormous resource to mobilize. And here in Sao Paulo region, I think I've been told it's about 300,000 smallholders. And on top of that, some bigger owners. And if those people can be activated and really engaged in this process and understand the potential values for the society and for themselves, then we have a great force to lean on. So never forget the smallholders. I think forests and forest landscapes, in a very broad meaning, they are a wonderful resource for the future society. We are really trying in Sweden, we have doing a lot of thinking about how we can have a society that is not depending on biofuel, that is not depending on degradation of resources around the world. And many of these discussions, or I would say all these discussions, ends up that we need to build a big part of our economy on forest resources. But we, of course, have to do it in a very clever and very sustainable and adapted to the local situation way of doing it. And this is a picture from a building project in a small town in Sweden, where they are building, the house is completely in wood, basically 100%, maybe not the elevator, I don't know. But, and it's heated in the winter, you know, the Swedish winter, 25 minus, it's heated by bioenergy. I hope the people will have these clothes. We're based on fibers. I have a very nice one myself. It's one of my best shirts, not this one, unfortunately, but so there is an opportunity. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, forest companies in Sweden, they were saying, no, bioenergy is not a good alternative. We want more nuclear power. Today, all the forest companies heavily involved in bioenergy. like 10 years ago, forest company had no interest of using the fibers for anything else than paper and pulp and paper and traditional products. Today they are looking for how can we be the big alternative to cotton that is not sustainable anymore. In many areas, the cotton production is one of the most dangerous one for the environment. And I'm happy to say that I think we get some really nice ideas to support large-scale restoration this morning. And I will give the words to you very soon. But before, I think that based on the few days here in Brazil, but also combined with my experience from, I think, about 30, 35 countries where I've been working, I would say that to make forest restoration, large-scale restoration of the native forests here and in other places possible in a reasonable time, and we don't have unlimited time, we need to have scalability in what we are doing. And as far as I can understand from literature and research, scalability goes together with income opportunities. So to just forget, remind everybody, because I didn't hear too much of that discussion, include income opportunities, especially for the smallholders, but for the whole society in this restoration discussion. Then you get the scalability and you get the possibility to be successful. So, by that, I have one question in English here, so I put it to the panel. Please, starting with you. If each of you can choose one, I start with one and then we can go around and I ask how much time we have. One aspect that you think is the most important one to reach scalability. The most important one to reach scalability in a reforestation, or well, let's use the word restoration project for native forests here in Sao Paulo. What's it say? So start with only one, if you can do that there, to make it happen.
Can I speak in Portuguese?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Bom, eu tinha listado uma série aqui, mas uma só. Vamos escolher aqui. Eu acho que as apresentações que nós tivemos deixa bem claro. Acho que depois a gente pode ir juntando as peças e formar aqui uma série de recomendações. Mas uma bem específica para São Paulo, bem específica para o contexto Brasil, que a gente ainda não comentou, que eu queria levantar a bola, é a gente conseguir usar recurso de compensação ambiental para a restauração. A gente ser eficiente para isso. Offset. Acho que a gente existe. Esse é o dinheiro que vai fazer startar a restauração no Brasil. Esse é o meu feeling e tenho conversado com alguns colegas. Existe dinheiro, o dinheiro está parado. Melhorar a eficiência para direcionar esse recurso para campo e de maneira inteligente, né? De que forma? Fazendo planejamento. Quais são as espécies que vão dar retorno econômico? Cultivando aí o futuro, né? Usar o recurso público que a gente tem de projeto de compensação para criar florestas que no futuro vão gerar renda para os proprietários rurais, enfim, desenvolver economia em cima. Bem pontual.
Torsten?
Only one. Only one.
Only one. Oh, but, well, we are flexible, aren't we?
Is this working? Yeah. I will answer this question in a more general terms. I don't think I have the knowledge to give detailed advice how you're going to do this in Sao Paulo. But some general idea, or one general idea, is that I would like to introduce the concept of institutional landscapes, if you like. I used to work with a large watershed management program in Ethiopia once, and we were all technical people, and we were all working with maps and technical aspects and tree species selection and construction of terraces and irrigation and all these technical things. And we were not, and this was a huge area, it was some 200,000 hectares, this watershed. But we were not that successful, and I think the mistake we made was that we didn't really have a clear understanding of the institutional landscape, both the formal landscape by government, but also the informal institutional landscape by the people, the tribal people who lived in this area. So that's my advice. Don't forget the institutional landscape.
¿Puedo hablar español? For me, one of the major concepts that can help in these restoration issues is the ecosystem management. Not forest management is okay, but ecosystem management is more global. And ecosystem management includes conservation, restoration, use, and planning. All different activities that humans can be develop in a certain region, area, or plot. And for ecosystem management, we need a very important training process for the future, especially to produce seeds, the new resources, human resources, to cope with the problems that we are confronting now in this Anthropocene epoch. Then I think that it's important to link the training programs in the universities at the bachelor and the postgraduate programs, masters and PhD, in order to incorporate in the training process the transdisciplinary work, as the secretary did this morning. It's very important because we need to deal with the capacity of communication among different sectors, no? From the academia, from the government sector, from the private sector, from the rural communities. And in the present, we have no enough programs training this kind of human resources. For me, it will be very important to have people with these abilities to communicate, to work interdisciplinarily, transdisciplinarily, and to conduct participatory work. And also, I think that we need also to have a good science that provide the basis for restoration. But good science is not enough. We need to provide also the ways to work together in order to find the best options for restoration or reforestation and different scenarios and different socio-ecological scenarios. And this is my main point.
I think if you start talking of large-scale restoration, it's about mobilizing society. So what's the key issue that people can, I think, dial into and create that kind of critical mass that's going to support? So if water is a crucial issue in Sao Paulo, I would suggest that's the kind of theme you need to kind of milk to the tea, like we've done in South Africa, and mobilize society around understanding why is it that we need to have this large-scale intervention that we're going to benefit from. I was about to say you must do propaganda campaigns, but I think there's enough good scientific evidence that actually backs up why it is you can do restoration. And if water is your outcome, how do you dial into making that the kind of almost currency that people can understand and mobilize around and say, This is why we think we can, I think, secure resources to pursue it. But that's just my one.
Do you think there is a need of special... is there a difference between the people living, for example, here in Sao Paulo? They understand that, wow, we are out of water, we have a problem. They can be mobilized by that argument. But then the farmers, some of them also really need water desperately, and they can also be mobilized by that argument, and they will maybe be investing working time and maybe even money to really secure the water because they need the water themselves. But all the other farmers that don't really need the water themselves, how do you include them? Because they will listen to this and they think that it's important, but that's maybe not rich people, so maybe they need to have some income or they need to do something else, and they work very hard in the factory or in the field or something, and they are very tired when they arrive home. They don't want to go out planting and taking away weeds.
I find it very difficult to imagine a farmer that doesn't view water as important. But maybe that's just South Africa. But I would imagine if you have enough of a critical mass of people that supports it, it creates that kind of peer pressure environment that you are able to convince it. I have to confess, in South Africa, we haven't been very successful at convincing everyone that this is the way to go. But that's probably because also of the kind of political landscape that we kind of, I think, live in, and where people have different interpretations of what is the agenda you're wanting to achieve with it. So before you can even take water, they say, whose political interest is it that actually is driving this agenda? So there's a lot of noise you have to work through before you can start, I think, dial into that. But I don't think I quite answered your question, but...
No, well, not really, because in your pictures, you had a picture where you had a red corner.
Yes.
And we are unfortunately still in this red corner, you said. And we want to go up to this corner.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the employment kind of shift.
Yeah, it was the employment, but in this case, maybe with the farmers here, it's a little bit different situation because these people can do a lot of this work themselves if they want to, if they have the incentives. So that is the challenge, to bring it up from the red corner where you don't have scalability up to the blue corner when people are enthusiastic and are prepared to put in their time and whatever is needed. Yeah. I think, given the time, I think we actually have one round more for the same question. So if you want, if any of you want to give another comment on this first question, feel free. You want?
Okay, so
start with Aurelio.
Eu tenho uma questão aqui direcionada especificamente para mim, que pergunta assim, Aurélio, quais os motivos que levaram o Brasil a apresentar apenas 80 mil hectares de compromisso de restauração com a iniciativa 2020, quando nós temos o potencial para fazer muito mais? Esse compromisso só para deixar claro, né, esse compromisso dos 80 mil hectares é um compromisso na escala subnacional do Espírito Santo. É lógico, o Espírito Santo é Brasil, então é um compromisso brasileiro, mas é um compromisso do governo capixaba. Isso acho que é bem importante. Explicar um pouquinho o que aconteceu. A primeira abordagem da iniciativa 2020 foi com os governos federais. Tanto é que em toda a América Latina nós temos compromissos, o único que aparece em nível de Estado hoje é o Espírito Santo. Os demais, todos foram compromissos nacionais. No momento onde nós fomos buscar, dialogar com o governo brasileiro, a gente estava numa situação de final de código, muita incerteza, depois passamos pelo período de eleições e aí depois entramos nessa crise que hoje nos encontramos. Então, não houve um espaço, nós não encontramos um espaço para dialogar sobre esses compromissos. É claro que trabalhamos junto com o governo para desenvolver as suas estratégias de restauração, né, o Plano Nacional de Revegetação, né, o Planaveg, ele foi estruturado, ele deu base para o Brasil apresentar um compromisso bem ambicioso, né, que será já foi anunciado, mas vai ser repetido na COP, de 12 milhões de hectares. Mas aí recentemente a gente mudou de estratégia, a gente começou a trabalhar em uma escala subnacional, trabalhando com os estados. Então, começamos a negociar com o estado aqui, outro ali, aqueles que são mais proativos na restauração, e alguns compromissos estão aparecendo. O primeiro assinado foi com o Espírito Santo. Eu tenho uma outra questão aqui que eu gostaria de compartilhar. So I'm going to ask. There's a question for us. I'm going to read in Portuguese, then I will translate in English. A questão é assim: como combater a cultura do toque de caixa? Eu vou tentar traduzir isso. In your experience, how to deal on the restoration agenda with the project culture that you have to deliverable a lot of products in a short period of time, and providing a lot of services and products, and with a short budget? How do you deal with that? And consider that we are working in the environment with a lot of uncertainty. So, bom, essa eu não vou responder, eu vou deixar para eles. Obrigado. Obrigado.
You put the question now.
Yeah, it's a question.
To the other guys in the panels, or
Yeah, for the other presenters.
No, I have a question for you. What about these other questions we have received? Is there time for that?
You can answer now.
you can answer now. Shall we take that one first?
Okay.
And then you get your question.
The question was, how could we reach convincing results given the time constraints and perhaps resource constraints?
The culture of project.
Huh?
The culture of
The
how to deal with the project culture.
Culture.
The culture to deliverable.
Well, I think it is a difficult question to answer, but I would like to start somewhere. And first of all, working in so many places around the world, I feel that Brazil is not at all a country where you have the highest insecurity. I think many global investors, we have been talking to them during the last year, they find Brazil as a quite attractive place for investment compared with places where you really have difficulties. So I think this is a place where you can do things long term and have a really good opportunities. It doesn't answer the question really, but I think another aspect on this question is that I think you have to realize that you have resources in this country. You have fantastic resources. You have a capacity. We have had many participants in our forest certification training program around for 20 years from Brazil. And those people had fantastic knowledge. They were always among the best people in the training programs. So you should not underestimate your own capacity to do things. I think you can do miracles here. So this is a piece of cake for Brazil. I overdid it a little bit because you overdo it on the other hand, I think.
Okay, I will try to answer that question. I will try to be perhaps smart and clever here and combine this general question with a question that was directed to me directly. Who is financing the Ångermanälven restoration project? Because it's a bit of same issue. And of course this funding of a project or a program is an issue. And as I haven't been involved in this restoration project of the restoration of the Ångermanälven, but as far as I understand, they have mobilized resources to get started. They haven't reached, haven't got all the funds required to restore the whole Ångermanälven watercourse with all its tributaries, but they have started in implementation in selected places where it is fairly easy to demonstrate results quickly because with the thought that this is one way of convincing the various interests and also providing the funds to continue funding the whole restoration, but maybe step by step. But they haven't started in the most difficult places. They have started where they can demonstrate results. And then they have mobilized resources from both private companies who have their activities in this area, and that's mainly forest companies and hydropower companies, and also local organizations, Forest Owners Association, and the Same People's Association contribute voluntary work, even if they don't provide funding. But I think it's not an easy question to answer, but I think you should go for, if you don't have the total funding scheme ready, go for something where you can demonstrate results fairly quickly.
In general, there are funds to support projects that are trying to restore or reforested tropical areas. No? For example, in Mesoamerica, we have these Mesoamerican biological corridors that has trying to support short-term projects to improve the cover of trees, tree cover. But they doesn't have a very strong basis working with the communities and also using scientific basis. And then I think that to assess whether it's possible to gain forest cover in landscapes, we need to identify the areas that are more important for food production, for example, for agriculture. Those areas that has been already degraded, and that we can apply restoration techniques different in order to recover forests. And also we have opportunities to maintain forest patches, remaining forest fragments in the landscape that have a very high value. But that needs to be discussed in a more multidisciplinary arena where the decisions can be supported by the government, local government, or state government, or federal government. But these kind of arrangements are not still very strong in many countries. And then for me, I think that we have already tools in order to conduct this planning, landscape planning, to identify the different areas where food production is possible, where reforestation is possible, where conservation of fragments is possible. And this multi-use landscape is I think, the future in general. But we need more agreements with the different sectors and actors in order to achieve this landscape view and to do possible these scenarios.
People look very hungry, so I better be quick. Huh? Okay. I think what's helped us to buy us time to kind of not having to deliver so quickly was the ability to secure public finances, where all you had to demonstrate was what is the jobs that you're able to generate with doing restoration, and then being then willing as government to say the long-term environmental impacts we can wait for. So identifying the short-term gains you have to deliver, but making them understand as well that the long-term environmental changes is not going to happen overnight. So if you can build, I think being able to fund the work has given us the freedom to almost set the time frame. And then being able then to convince external funders, this is what actually makes sense to us. But maybe it's a broader question of how do we value GDP? Where do you factor in ecological infrastructure? And then maybe you will, by your very definition of that, start building in long-term time frames for the benefits you want to see and not be kind of, linked to that. I don't know if I should head into the question as well that was posed to me.
Oh, there was one more.
Oh, what's there?
Well, can you do a very short answer? Because I didn't know there was one extra on that side.
Oh, I was given this additional question.
Okay, a new one.
Yeah.
Oh, please, make a short answer.
Okay. It was a question around governance and what are we doing to deal with some of the governance challenges in South Africa. Now, I think currently the problem is the the cascading from national government to provincial government to local government. The policy don't necessarily always streamline logically right down to implementation level. Now we have a national development plan that's meant to provide that logic for cascading down. But it's going to take some time, I think, to have that logic flow through and make people part of that process of understanding what we're doing here at our local level ties in with that national development policy. So similarly with our restoration initiatives, is kind of following that cascading from this is a national interest we want to achieve with it at the provincial level and at the local level. This is the role you have to play in it. So that's a big part of how we want to ensure we get the governance buy-in, but also then come up with institutions that can actually do that a lot more easier in an integrated way. Because our bureaucracy is still very inefficient. I don't know if that's only local to South Africa, but we really have to think creatively about how do we actually break down some of those institutional boundaries that have similar outcomes and goals in mind, but they're structured to actually almost do things in silos and separate to one another. So that's my quick answer.
And I've been under heavy pressure from Torsten that he wants to say 3 words.
Well, 4 or 5, but I have a question here about key habitats, and it's a bit complicated to explain, and I know everyone is hungry, but the one who asked this question about key habitats, how key habitats has been mapped and identified, located, he or she is, I would be happy to answer that question if you can approach me when we have a break or something like that.
It's a perfect question for lunch. So everybody that's interested in how to identify key habitats, which is a very interesting question, join the same table as Torsten and maybe me also then. Is that okay? Perfect. And just as a final word, and also like an answer on this question that you have put about how to get things, most important things for get things happening. And I think be sure that the smallholders and the forest owners, the 600,000 hectares, that the people that are out there not only get the motivation and maybe financial instruments for doing it, actually they need very clear handbooks or best management practice. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be fully covered on research 100%. But the best knowledge you have at the moment being with the best experts, with the best universities, put it down into handbooks or instructions, ideas. Give them a lot of freedom within a framework because we don't know exactly what is right and wrong. But some guidelines is extremely important because otherwise people will not start acting because they don't know exactly what to do and they don't trust their own judgment. And also things might go very wrong. So once again, thank you very much for listening to us, even if we are now 3 minutes over time. Thank you.
Então, faremos uma pausa para o almoço e retornaremos às 14 horas. Tem uma lista de restaurantes aqui no balcão de inscrições para quem precisar. Restaurante próximo à secretaria. Obrigada.